important continued activist threat. I mean, we think about this every day. Generational shifts, increased global opportunities, and freedom to operate in challenges. And that's primarily what we're trying to do with the group that I head up. I think Kay, when she put together the presentation or the idea in the presentation, made a comment of, will our customers accept new ag technologies? And I feel very strongly that we need to do something different than what we've done in the past, because whether it's our BST or it's use of beta agonists or it's use of gestational crates or free-range chickens versus cage layers, we have not, as an industry, done a good job of communicating our technologies to the consumer. And if we don't do that, there's no reason for new ag technologies in the future. So we're trying to play catch up on many of the technologies that we have out there currently, but to add new technologies, it's kind of sobering of what's going to happen, because we're going to have to focus on this. The U.S. consumer, but not yet just U.S. consumer. We're going to have to focus on export markets and the hindrance that we have in getting to those marketplaces. But you know, I just throw out a technology as an example that we've gotten thrown under the bus for, gestational crates. So if we would have named those and been more transparent on those and called them maternity units, maybe that's not exactly the right one either, but gestational crates doesn't sound very consumerish to me. And neither does RBST. Does that sound very consumerish to you? Everything that we've got to focus on up here is the consumer, and that's what we're doing more and more in my company. And I think if I can get something across to everybody that's in the room representing agriculture and technologies going forward, is that from the very start, when we start looking in the case of pharmaceutical companies, we start looking at discovery products. Can we frame that discovery product so that at the end of 17 years or 16 years, or whatever it takes to get to that product to the marketplace, will it be accepted by the consumer? And that's frankly what we're talking about. When we put a product in a discovery situation, I had the fortune of instituting a product to discovery, which I have a patent on, and that was in 2004. It was just moving out of discovery into development last year in 2014. And if everything goes right, it will be 8 years minimum to get that to the marketplace. So as I saw an individual presentation from someone from John Deere last week, and he said, we've got to be looking at the horizon. And that's what we're trying to do with John Deere. But I can tell you, when you're looking at maybe 20 years to get a product from start to finish, you've got to be looking on the horizon. And we have to keep these people, the family, in tune with what we're talking about. But let's take a step back. I mean, I was relatively young, not a millennial, but in the millennial frame here when Megatrends came back, 1982, a long time ago. But just think about what they were talking about. And I think one really good quote was, a new source of power is not going to be money in the hands of a few, but information in the hands of many. Now, that was in 1982. And by 2000, another megatrend was, we're drowning in information, but starved for knowledge. And if you think about that, in today's society, we were moving from an industrial society to an information society, and this is exactly what we are faced with from an agriculture standpoint. We have information, and there's lots of information out there, but it isn't correct knowledge. I say, and we do a fair amount of consumer market research, and that family that we're looking at and it's been a theme I think that's run through the sessions that we've had today. Moms have a lot of questions and are seeking information about how food is grown and how animals are raised, because they want to do the best thing for their families. But whom can they turn to for that knowledge that they crave? With social networking, and we got 25 words or less, typically, that we're going to provide that information to them. And that means that somebody else in this room over here, somebody in the back of the room, if you're social networking, they can become an expert and give you the information that you're required, that you want, but it's not necessarily the right information. But if you want the right information, you can also turn to Dr. Oz. Although he's been challenged a little bit in the past few weeks of whether the information he's providing is the correct information, or was it a PR stunt to get more people going to his program every afternoon, where he's typically got an audience of about 4 million people watching and disseminating information that's not necessarily always correct. But the reality for agriculture is, and this came out was in Jeff's presentation this morning, consumers' desire for authenticity and transparency, and they want the real facts from us, not facts that we want to feed out. And I think that was also a comment earlier too, that are we really willing to take a stand? And I'd say for our company, we try to take a stand, but it's a generational shift to go from what's really what we really think and what we really feel, because every time we make that step, we have an opportunity to have somebody out there questioning what we're saying. So we have to be ready to stand up for what we believe. Eroding consumer trust. Consumers are really skeptical, and they're skeptical more and more about the food that they eat. And that distrust extends to industries, including agriculture. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, but consumers trust people. And they need to feel that they know us and not know the confinement unit, whether it be for poultry or for swine or for the feedlot for cattle. They have to have a face behind that. The last thing that we want, and I think we should be thinking about showing in presentations that we make to the consumer, is this this multi-million-dollar building that we've just put up to house cattle or to house pigs or to house poultry. What we need to do is show our face, because people like people. Kay had the Peterson brothers. I'm a farmer here, and made a presentation to us. It was either last year or the year before. And the brother that made the presentation said he had a number of consumers tell him that you are the type of person that we want to produce our food for us, because we know you. And he said, thank you, I agree with you, and from what you think is an industrial farm is what we do in Kansas. And if you put that face on the consumer, on our production facilities, I think we're going to go a lot farther. Big is bad, I think we all know that, but transparency is no longer an option, because this is the top picture, the idyllic farm that I came from, and probably a number of people in this room came from. That's what the consumers want to think about. And the reality that they think is out there is the factory farm down in the bottom picture. So, educated consumer. A market research that was done by a group here in Kansas City, 66% of the consumers would like to see food industry take more action in educating people on how their food is produced. 67% think it's important to understand how the food is produced. So they have a real interest, but they're also very concerned, whether it be animal antibiotics, and this was just a survey taken last year in 2014. I think today, if we were to go out and take that same survey, this is a moving target because animal antibiotics is probably a concern by 70, 80, 90% of the consumers out there versus what it was. Animal hormones. I think one of the, well, I'll talk about that in just one second, and animal treatment, obviously. When the team that I have reporting to me is out talking to the retailers, they come up with a whole list of things that they think is very important, that's top of mind to them. Managing beef prices, obviously, very much in the meat mix. Other concerns, antibiotics, food safety, animal well-being, meat quality, et cetera. But from a technology standpoint, something that really stands out when we're talking to the retailers is, don't add a technology that you expect me as a retailer to defend. So we have to take those new technologies that we're developing and communicate those and communicate them in such a way that, that the consumer says, yes, this is a good thing for us. Meat labels, and you can read these as easily as I can. But I think one of the, and we're seeing more, and Mandy's going to talk about meat labels, and I just wanted to make a interesting comment. I see them, you see them, but one of the most deceiving ones that I've seen out lately is there's no hormones used in chicken, in this chicken product that's on the market. There is an asterisk there that says it is illegal to use hormones in poultry production in the US. That's how important it is. Same way when I mean, Merck is the largest producer of hormones implants going into cattle in the U.S. I was at a meeting in Chile about 3 or 4 years ago, and I was talking about the use of hormones in cattle. And I mean, talk about the furor, especially coming from Europeans that were in the audience. And they came up to me yesterday, or excuse me, the next day when I was at our booth that was on the floor, and one vet in particular from Germany came in and said, "You made us." I didn't agree with the presentation you were making yesterday, and I was one of the people that was very vocal about making the use of hormones in cattle. But he said, "You've made us think about things that we don't want to think about in Europe." And he said, frankly, based upon what you said yesterday, he said, "I think that we should be considering this." And Kathy, from a cattle standpoint, I mean, that's almost unheard of, thinking about the use of hormones in cattle. But on the other hand, I can remember almost the exact place in the road I was going home one night and listening to NPR, as I do quite regularly, and I don't necessarily agree with everything that they say, but they had a French cattle producer on the program, and he was talking about how in the US we pump our cattle full of hormones. Now, we all know that this is a very small amount of hormone that we put in the cattle. But if you think about it, what do we do in the US? We take away the hormone producing organ of the bulls because we know what it's going to do to them. And way I was taught, but we add back about 10% of the hormone. Now, is that a consumer-facing argument? No, it isn't. It's not the correct way to talk about that to consumers. But maybe the correct way is to say, versus Europe and how they produce your meat, we have reduced the amount of hormones in a steer by 90%. Different way, easily to frame, but from a consumer standpoint, I've used that a number of times with consumer groups, and they can relate much easier to it. So value of technologies, And because it doesn't make any difference if we're talking about poultry, we're talking about pork, we're talking about aquaculture, or in this case, we're talking about beef. We are producing a lot more beef with fewer animals by the use of technology. So here's my 9 billion slide, like everyone else that has one up here. But, hunger trumps everything else that we have out there. 1 in 8 people suffer from chronic hunger. According to the source that I looked up, over 3 million children starve to death each year. And believe it or not one recorded death from GMOs, RBST, hormones, or beta agonists, everything that the consumer wants us to take out. But, I talked a little bit, I've got a slide coming up on the food elitist, and we can't be that way. We have to frame our message correctly so that the consumer will allow us to use these technologies. Because we've got a lot going for us. Ag industry is steeped in history and heritage. And this is what a typical consumer would like to think about when they're seeing their production, thinking about the way things are produced. But all we have to do when we talk about technology is step back, and it's a long time ago, but we've made tremendous advances in livestock production since 1950. If you look at the picture on the left, the grand champion Angus female from the Fort Worth Livestock Show in 1955. Not much bigger than a Mastiff. And from a dog stand, he's standing up about to here on me. And Cameron, do you think there's a little fat on that animal? I think the yield percentage would be pretty poor. You might even have a hard time finding the muscles on it. In the same way with the pig on the right or your left. Again, a championship hog. So even through genetics, we've made a lot of advancements. But millennials, I'll throw in my one slide on millennials, care about the brands and to do something in the same way that Jeff we had it up here. They want to be engaged with the brands. They want the brand to cause a change. They want the brand to stand for something. And I think this fits right in there. Is all that we're trying to work against is food democracy is what they would like rather than a food aristocracy. So they don't want us to tell them how we are going to raise animals or raise crops and say, deal with it. This is how we're going to deal with it. It's part of our life, and it's part of our life going forward. We have to be able to explain what we're doing and do so with confidence that it's the right thing. So throw in a couple slides about retailers where we spend a lot of our time, and I just threw up some of the food brands up here. But on one side, if we were to look at the screen, we would say that we as an ag industry are telling the retailers what we're doing and why we're doing it and whether you should like it or you shouldn't like it. But on the other side of that screen, we've got the consumer going in, and whether you're talking to a Walmart or a Costco or a Safeway, they've got their consumer panels and saying, I don't like this, and I don't like this, and I don't like whatever. And we've got bombs out there ready to explode if we don't handle these things correctly. So if you're a retailer, what's the easiest thing to do is to acquiesce, is to say, yes, I guess you're right. I don't know anything about this technology. I mean, look at lean, finely textured beef or pink slime. That was a true case of acquiescing when they got a microphone shoved in front of their face. But if we had done a good job of explaining why we were doing what we were doing with that, at least the retailers might have stepped back and said, think about what we've got here. And, here's what you're talking about. And that's what we're trying to do in my small group as we move forward is not necessarily that we've trained the retailers on everything that they need to know in order to promote this technology. That isn't what we're doing. I mean, you saw that earlier. Don't give me a technology that you want me to defend. But we want to have our face out there in front of the retailer with enough frequency that they can pick up the phone and call us. And that, I mean, we can't reach everybody within that retailer, but the right people say, tell me about this. I know you told me about it earlier. Tell me about it. So who do the brands turn for their information? That's us. That's what we're trying to do that. We've got just a couple minutes here to wrap up, but I found this was a interesting comment. This is about 2 weeks ago, but Heinz and Kraft are going together to create efficiencies. And that's what we're trying to do with technologies in industries, create efficiencies. But this person who was writing this article says certain supplies of certain foods aren't growing as fast as demand. And she was talking about as we raise our income for the middle class, that meat protein, as an example, is not, the supplies are not gaining ground as fast as the demand for those. But one of the biggest markets that we talk about all the time within the industry is, you take all the people in China and you raise the amount of beef that they consume by even a half a pound. It's tremendous amount of beef that it's going to take. Same way with pork, same way with poultry. But some of the technologies that we've been using here for a long time are not accepted in China. And we can go into the reasons why they aren't accepted in China, but just, cattle implants are used in about 90%, 92, 93% of the cattle that are raised in the US. What does that yield? About 90 pounds of additional meat. What does that feed? Almost 42 million additional people, their per capita consumption of beef. Beta agonists, ractopamine used in pork. I think it's somewhere around 10 pounds, just for easy measuring. If all of the pigs were used ractopamine, about 24 million people that we would feed without any additional feed, water, land, animals. But those technologies are under scrutiny and they're not being used. I was really torn whether I should throw this up here, but this is who we have to market to. And we especially see this in U.S. and in Europe. Is the food elitists? They're telling us we can go to Whole Foods, we can buy organic, and we can buy natural products because we can afford that, and we think that everybody else ought to be doing the same thing, and that's the part that we've got to get away from. So I can see Andy is getting anxious for me to get out there, but I'll just flip to the last slide that we've got here is for technologies to be accepted by the food chain. We all, let's get agriculture on the right plane and concern yourself with the consumer as we move forward. Help to fill that knowledge void. Be part of the solution. Take an opportunity to stand in front of the meat counter on a Saturday morning and talk to people about their meat purchases. I've done it, and it can make you feel really good about the information that you can pass forward. And lastly, support the industries that are advancing technologies, because I can guarantee you, whether it be Monsanto, whether it be Elanco, it's Merck, or whoever is talking about technologies, they won't invest in those technologies if we don't see that they're going to be able to be used in the future. So let's all do our job in communicating correctly. Thank you.
Our second panelist is Mandy Hagan, Vice President of State Affairs and Grassroots for Grocery Manufacturers Association. Prior to joining GMA, she spent 2 years with Walgreens as Director of Government Affairs for Health and Wellness. Mandy ran the State Affairs program for the Consumer Healthcare Products Association for 4 years prior to her stint at Walgreens. And she is a member of the Virginia State Bar, holding her Juris Doctorate from George Mason University and a BA from the University of Virginia, two fine academic institutions. And UVA just has such a beautiful campus. I really love the campus there. Please welcome our second panelist, Mandy Hagan.
Good afternoon. I'm glad I didn't plan to start off by telling a joke after the way John's went over. So we should be smooth sailing. I think what I'm going to present will dovetail really well with John's presentation, because what he gave was a great overview of technology in agriculture and in food. And I'm going to take a deeper dive into one specific area, which is crop biotechnology. So a little bit about us. GMA is a 107-year-old trade association. We represent food, beverage, and consumer product manufacturers. We are here today to talk about feeding 9 billion people. And so we have to ask the question at the outset, is that a problem? And my answer would be, only if you want to eat. We have a growing population. We need more resources, and authorities predict higher costs in the future. In addition to these issues, we lose 3,000 acres of productive farmland to development every day in this country, as I'm sure you all know. The number of people at risk of hunger in the developing world will grow from 881 million in 2005 to more than 8 billion people by 2050. So obviously, genetic modification of crops is a hotly debated topic these days. And the question, can biotechnology help with these problems of meeting food needs, I think is easily answered that it already is doing that. The biggest impact, obviously, is in yields. You know, GM crops, because they're not competing with weeds for nutrients and water and sunlight, have an increased yield. But there are other benefits, as you can see, and in addition, we now have the first biotech drought-tolerant maize, which, after being first planted in 2013, increased more than 5-fold in 2014. I'm sure that's welcome news for some farmers in California. We are able to grow more with less land, and this total area requirement of 37 million additional acres that would have been needed to provide the same yield is equal to 9% of the arable land in the US. Worldwide in 2014, 18 million farmers planted a record 447 million acres of biotech crops in 28 countries. Of the 28 countries which planted biotech crops in 2014, 20 were developing countries. So this is a worldwide issue, not just centric to the US. More than half the world's population, 60%, or 4 billion people, live in the 28 countries planting biotech crops. So why is there any controversy? This seems like a great thing. And first you have to address the issue of safety, because that's the automatic first concern when you're talking about food and such an emotional issue as how we feed our population. And the answer to whether it's safe has been a resounding yes. And there really should be no controversy, as this is a very widely held consensus at this point. There have literally been decades of study into the issue of the safety of food produced from genetically modified crops. You'll note on this slide and a few of the others after this that I'm referencing the declaration of Dr. Alan McEwen. And FYI, Dr. McEwen is a molecular geneticist employed at UC Riverside and provided expert testimony in litigation between the industry and the state of Vermont on their biotech labeling. And his testimony puts a lot of this information into one place where you can easily digest it and get the whole history of crop biotechnology and the history of regulation of it and how it's been tested over the years. So there's been literally decades of testing, as I mentioned, and what we found is that the conversation about the safety of GM crops tends to gravitate towards perfection. Is there 100% safety that can be demonstrated? And as scientists would tell you, there's no such thing. And the real barometer is it any different from its conventional counterparts? I had about 10 more slides just with the quotes from the many bodies that have looked at this from either the US or internationally and weighed in with their views on this question of safety. And I pared it down to just 3 or 4 because I think you get the idea. The authorities that have credibility on this issue have spoken out and said, there's no difference between GM crops and their conventional counterparts. And I think this one is especially relevant in this section about claims about feeding GM crops to animals, causing all kinds of problems. And if you spend any time on social media, you will see constant references to alleged animal studies and the problems that have been found. And they just don't clear any sort of rigorous scientific scrutiny. The AMA has actually given their position that not only are these products safe, but that there's no justification for having special labeling. And I'll have a lot more to say about labeling in the next few slides. The World Health Organization, no effects on human health, the European Commission, these literally go on and on and on. But this one may be my favorite, the Girl Scouts. It should be a settled issue at this point, right? So again, why are we even talking about it? Where does this concern about safety come from? And if you ask the editorial board of the Washington Post, they'll say it's activists overstating risk based on fear and a distrust of corporations. And I think that's a lot of the same, sentiment that John was sharing on other issues. There are literally organizations that have been formed for no other purpose than to put out scientific sounding findings on GM crops and try to build this notion that there is something to fear and some sort of legitimate concern out there. There's the famous Seralini rat study that I'm sure you've seen pictures of the rats with tumors. And not only was this study thoroughly debunked, so much so that it was retracted from this original publisher and expunged from their database as if it had never existed, but it was then published again, and the same criticisms still were relevant. And this was not a new study. This was just a republishing of the same study. And it, again, did not hold up to any sort of scientific scrutiny. So maybe there's another reason why we're having these concerns about GM crops, because there's no legitimate concern for safety. So I wanted to just back up and put a little bit of info in about what they are, more importantly, what they're not. And we've all seen pictures of tomatoes with syringes in them. Genetic modification isn't adding chemicals to food. It is a process at the level of growing the plant. And it is very widely adopted at this point in the US, with 93% of corn, 94% of soybeans, and 96% of cotton in 2014 coming from GM varieties. A common myth about GM crops is that they're not regulated by the federal government. And in fact, crops, animals, food, labeling, all are very heavily regulated. You could fill a library with the statutes and regulations that govern them. At the end of the day, you essentially have 4 agencies that have oversight that they share. These agencies coordinate and sequence review at every stage so that by the time a genetically engineered product is ready for commercialization, it has undergone substantial review and testing during the research phase. And information regarding its safety is available. FDA's specific policy with respect to food is that the regulatory status of a food, irrespective of the methods by which it is developed, is dependent on the objective characteristics of the food. To date, over 100 GM crops varieties have been reviewed by FDA, and in every case, the nutritional and other composition of food derived from GM plants has been the same as that of the same food derived from non-GM plants of the same species. And I'd like to point out the great deal of time and expense that companies go through to make it through this regulatory process and have deregulated status, meaning that they can commercially grow these varieties. $100 million, and the frequent criticism from activists is these technology developers are doing their own testing, as if there's any other way that it could possibly be done. The goalpost would simply be shifted if we expected the FDA and the taxpayer to foot that bill instead. So just to set the foundation more about what we're talking about here, the first GM product was insulin, and GM insulin is cheaper and more effective than the alternatives, which are derived from hogs and cattle and therefore obviously spares the animals. Today, almost all insulin-dependent diabetics are injecting GM insulin. Chymosin is a GM variety of rennin, the milk clotting agent used in cheese making, and most cheese today is used with genetically modified chymosin. Papaya, you may have heard about this story that one of the earliest uses of the GM technology was to save the Hawaiian papaya, which was being devastated by the ring spot virus, which has no treatment, no cure. And they had to genetically modify a strain that was resistant naturally to the ring spot virus. So, we've talked about how necessary these crop modifications are, how safe they are, well-researched, well-regulated. So the fun part of the presentation is the response to the question, why not label them anyway? Because we certainly get asked that question very frequently at GMA. And I found this picture on the internet, which I love because especially note the warning that the Abercrombie & Fitch may contain clothing, and the fountain contains water. This is really one of the most fundamental objections that we have to this GM labeling, is that it's pointing out the obvious in most cases. In addition, it doesn't tell you anything. And that's really the biggest flaw in the labeling requirements that we've seen in the States. It won't tell you which ingredient is genetically modified. Anything with cheese in it could have a GM label because of the chymosin, and that doesn't tell you anything about crops at all. Even if you did have an ingredient label specific enough to say that it was a GM corn variety, for example, it doesn't tell you what trait. So if your concern is glyphosate, you would have to label all the way down to the level of saying this is herbicide-resistant corn that was used in this product to give any sort of meaningful information. And at the end of the day, for food manufacturers, the molecules for GMO sugar or conventional sugar or organic sugar look exactly the same. There's no difference. This is also why we frequently get asked by activists, if GMO ingredients are so great, why not proudly label and say the product has been improved with genetic technology? And the answer to that is, that would be as misleading as a label that says something about containing GM ingredients that's meant to be a warning. Whether it's meant to say something good about it or meant to be a warning, in either case, if the ingredients are identical, you couldn't say this product is better because it has GM sugar. The crop might have been better. The actual plant may have had all kinds of benefits for the farmer. It may have made the ingredient cheaper, but your food is the same. And that's why we can't brag about having a GM ingredient in food. That would be getting you in trouble with FDA. When you actually have oils, starches, sugars in your products, they don't contain any genetic information anyway. So this is one of our concerns with labeling requirements that include sugar, starches, and oils, because they're conveying the information that there's genetic modification in these ingredients. There's actually no genetic information in the ingredients at all, and yet under every labeling proposal that we've seen in the States, these products would have to be labeled as genetically modified. So I'm sure you've heard increased costs with genetic modification, with mandatory labeling of GM ingredients. And that's not because printing the label adds that much new cost. Obviously, changing the labels does add a cost. But this research looked at what it would take for manufacturers to try to replace some of their ingredients with non-GM versions so that they wouldn't have to change their labels. And those ingredients cost more. And that's one source of the increased costs. Obviously, when you have different labeling requirements in different states, there's literally no way that food manufacturers can comply with that no matter how hard they try. Right now, there are 20 states that have labeling legislation that was introduced or carried over into the 2015 session. And they have different definitions, they require different wording. There's no uniformity to the way these bills are being written. They have everything under the sun exempted that you can think of. They always exempt restaurants and alcohol. They deal with cheese in different ways. So even cheese, it's not clear how you'd have to label it from one state to the next. In Vermont, they just carve out all dairy, period. In some of the ballot initiatives, they would carve out enzymes or processing aids to get rid of having to label for chymosin. Some of them take the approach that they will carve out meat and dairy from animals fed GM grains so that you don't have to label cheese under that rationale. The starches, sugars, and oils, as I said, that have no genetic material always are included and have to be labeled. What about insulin? Most insulin is genetically modified. Vaccines have genetically modified ingredients. Cotton, the vast majority of cotton is genetically modified, and it can be either BT cotton or it can be the glyphosate resistant type. Probably everyone in this room is wearing cotton that was genetically modified. Let that sink in. So this is another, I think one of the compelling reasons that labeling is so troubling is that there's no bright lines that make sense around what should be labeled and what shouldn't. If you're trying to inform consumers, what are you really getting at with these labels? And a great example is the naturally GM sweet potatoes. And this has been making a lot of headlines because this was just discovered about a month ago. And the reason that this is so significant is, you know, most crops, as everyone will tell you, have been modified in one way or another over the millennia. You know, they've been crossbred, hybridized. We've been messing with the genetic structure of plants for as long as we've been farming. But the difference in this one is that the agrobacterium transfer DNA is the vehicle that's actually used sometimes when humans purposely modify crops. So the actual result looks like it would look if this had been genetically modified by man. And that's why this one really blurs the lines about, is this genetic modification that should be labeled or isn't it? What's the rationale again? Same thing with sunflowers. And it's not just sunflowers, there's a number of crops that have developed herbicide resistance, not because they were genetically modified to be herbicide resistant, but just because they, for some reason, mutated. And sunflowers are an example. So this is the money slide, in my opinion, the one that really gets to the heart of the matter. When you stigmatize technology, technology providers are scared away from investing in it. And that's what we're concerned about at the end of the day, and why GMA and our companies are so involved in this issue. There are tons of benefits of genetic modification. I've talked about a few in terms of increased yields and no-till farming and all of those things that are pretty common knowledge, and I'm going to get to some of the even better ones. But I think this kind of gets lost in the discussion that all of those benefits go away if you demonize the technology to the point that no one wants to invest in it anymore. And we don't want to see that happen. Many of the great benefits that would be lost, among them, goodbye orange juice. First found in the US in 2005, citrus greening is a disease spread by psyllids, and it has spread to all 29 counties producing oranges in Florida. Currently, the most effective way to get rid of it is to cut down all of the infected trees. Figures released in April by USDA show that Florida is expected to produce 102 million boxes of oranges this year. That is the lowest number since the state produced 100.5 million boxes in 1968. Just in 2004, Florida produced 2.5 times as many, with 242 million boxes of oranges. This is actually an example of genetic modification where orange trees they borrowed a trait from spinach. Spinach is naturally resistant to citrus greening, and the trees that they're now planting with this trait are showing that they are resistant naturally to citrus greening, and they're surviving even when being exposed to it. But they have a long way to go still through the regulatory process and are not yet commercially available. Another one is golden rice, and this is in the news a lot, and I'm sure you've heard about it before, but in developing countries where white rice is the dominant food, 500,000 people become blind and 2 million people die every year because of vitamin A deficiency. If you can add vitamin A to their staple food, you can actually save lives. Bananas are same issue. If your staple food is bananas and not rice, you can put vitamin A in bananas and again, save people's lives. The innate potato, I'm sure you've heard of, gets rid of acrylamide. So when it's baked at a high temperature, it has less of that potentially cancer-causing ingredient. And acrylamide is a natural occurring ingredient. So before I wrap up, I didn't put a slide in about it, but I want to mention, if you feel as we do that this is an issue that you want to see this technology protected, you can support legislation at the federal level that would actually provide uniformity and protect this technology going forward. GMA and the Coalition for Safe, Affordable Food support federal legislation HR 1599, which would mandate FDA review of all new traits. Currently, that's technically voluntary, although every new trait has gone through it. It would establish uniformity in labeling GM ingredients by setting up a certification through USDA and ensure that a non-GMO label means the same thing on every product. Labeling for the absence of GM ingredients provides consumers with the transparency and knowledge that actually means something on the food label. And we support providing a voluntary non-GMO label through federal uniform legislation. And we will, I guess, be taking questions now.
Outstanding pair of presentations, and I could tell from following the Twitter feed that had a high level of engagement as we've had all day with the presentations. So I have a couple of our college Aggies who are walking around with microphones, so throw your hands in the air and we will have questions for either John or Mandy or both on the topics of this discussion. Floor is open. We'll start with Dr. Lindsay right here on my left.
Well, excuse me. I've heard a lot of people say that if we were to get some celebrities to take more of an interest in being pro-GMO or GE technology, that this would help drive it through the marketplace better. I guess, what are your thoughts? I mean, insulin, obviously, cotton, whether they realize it or not, are probably two of the more common ones. But I guess, what are your thoughts on getting more uptake of celebrity presence to promote this?
I mean, you know, we would certainly welcome that. We wouldn't turn away the support of anybody that could help raise the profile and get more of the factual information out there. I think it's hard because our side of the story is much more complicated and there's so much information that has to be conveyed. It doesn't fit well into a soundbite or a cute meme or something that gets people fired up in social media necessarily the way the other side does. So what's the incentive for a celebrity to just put boring facts out there and, you know, potentially save lives through getting this technology finally approved as far as, you know, golden rice? It's that the rice is ready to go as far as its development, but fields have been uprooted because activists are opposed to the technology. So I think the bottom line, you know, we'd welcome it, but how do you get the interest from those individuals?
It's a good question. I always wanted to get somebody like Jack Hanna or somebody involved as a celebrity on animal well-being issues. If you're not a big Jack Hanna or zoo fan, maybe that doesn't resonate as much with you. Got another question here from the middle of the floor, but I think Andy makes a really great point too. What's the incentive for the celebrity? And unfortunately, if it's money, if it's a paid type relationship, as many of those sponsored type relationships are, then immediately that celebrity is a shill, as the word is so often used. I mean, the Vani Haris of the world are number one for saying, "Oh, Mandy had something to say nice about GMOs. She's clearly a shill." John's company has her in their pocket. There's some nefarious backdoor relationship there between those two organizations, and that's the way the social media cycle works. Yes, sir.
So a follow-on from Mandy, excuse me. And so in the animal side, we don't yet have products of biotech. What would your advice be to the industry about how we could go about bringing them in?
Not sure I understand the question.
It's the same question you were just asked about the crop side. But instead of getting a celebrity, I'm not asking about a specific tactic, but the animal livestock industry has not had access to GM technology. We haven't been able to get a product through the approval process. When we do, what do we do to make sure that it is in fact accepted?
So, I mean, isn't the GM salmon finished? It's not approved yet? Okay. I mean, that would be the example that comes to mind. And I think what the biggest lesson that the animal side can take away from the crop side is that I think this would have all played out very differently had the initial crops been ones that focused on benefit to consumers. Yeah. There's a much better story to be told when you're talking about adding vitamin A to save lives or getting rid of acrylamide in potatoes to potentially lower cancer rates. But those weren't framing the issue. They came about after people had their attitudes set in a lot of ways. So the salmon is a great example because the purpose of it is that it grows faster. You can make this great product available to people more affordably. Isn't the end game of having this wonderful source of protein, lean and antioxidants and whatever all salmon is good for, that it will be more readily available to people that right now maybe can't afford it. And that would be my advice, is that the benefit to the consumer is what should be focused on, not so much the benefit to the grower.
So Mandy, the natural corollary to that question is then, so if Golden Rice had been the first blockbuster biotech event instead of, say, Roundup Ready soybeans or cotton, would the storyline have played out differently?
I think it would, because I think for the consumer, they appreciate that the product is cheaper, that it helps keep food prices down. But it's so easy to skew that and twist it around into being just a benefit for a company. If it's a benefit for the consumer in the end, I hope that the new products, the Arctic apples as well, it's not a health benefit so much to the consumer other than the fact that it'll be more widely available. I would love to see, as the producers want to see, sliced apples everywhere, as ubiquitous as other snack foods, because now they'll be more appealing because they won't brown. So those benefits to the consumer, I don't think it's too late, I guess is what I'm trying to say. That now that those products are coming through the pipeline, their benefits need to be communicated, and I think it will change the dialogue.
Other questions? Those are a couple of good ones to get us started. Clear in the back by the door, and then we'll come up to the gentleman here in the middle row.
Can you give us an update on the response, I guess, to the legislation that passed in Vermont? I know that's currently in the court system, but an update as to where that is and the direction it's heading?
Well, we just a couple of hours ago released a press release that the decision has been made to appeal the decision in Vermont. So the court last week basically made a decision that they didn't grant the state's motion to dismiss, so our claims go forward, but they also didn't grant the preliminary injunction. So what that means is that essentially in a little over a year, Vermont can start enforcing the requirement for the labeling. And obviously, that's something that companies have to start focusing on, because it takes more than a year to identify what products need to be labeled and make the labeling and distribution changes. So by giving no extension through a preliminary injunction of the amount of time companies can comply, it's obviously a huge concern. And so hopefully through the appeals process that can be addressed. And I would add that, the complexity of the law in Vermont is only made worse by the fact that all of the requirements fall solely on manufacturers. So even if companies tried to set up distribution systems where they made sure that the products with the right labels would go into Vermont, they really have no control over that. And there's no penalty for a retailer for having the product with the wrong label on the shelf. So with fines that are $1,000 a day per product, you could accrue $1 million penalty for having a product on the shelf for 10 days, even though the manufacturer didn't intend for that product to wind up there. So talking about costs that are going to get passed on to the consumers, when you look at the extremely punitive nature of the requirement in Vermont, it should be a concern for everybody, not just the manufacturers.
Any other questions, sir?
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I'm not sure we use this link between feeding the world and a growing population and the technology that's necessary to do that. I think we all would agree that if we go back to the old ways of producing food, we could never meet the challenge of feeding the world. And yet today we have a real dichotomy, because we have companies out here that are tearing down those technologies that we all agree are necessary to feed the world to support their today's marketing program or sustainability program. I wonder how those companies might feel if somebody stuck a microphone in their face and asked them, why are they contributing to increased food insecurity in the world, or to put it more bluntly, increased hunger and starvation in the world in order to market their products today? On the converse of that, I wonder how those same consumers that might support labeling of GMOs or getting rid of GMOs might respond to a marketing program that said, we proudly support the decrease in starvation and hunger around the world through the use of safe and approved genetically modified foods. If that might change the conversation. I don't think we use that quite enough, and it seems like a real dichotomy between the two.
So it's an interesting question. Both of you have some different background on it. I guess the sticky wicket I'll throw out there is the latest consumer data I've seen suggests consumers in the U.S. don't really care about feeding the world all that much. They might care about hunger and feeding hungry kids in the U.S. in an abstract sense, but the concept of feeding the world doesn't really move the needle anymore. How does that complicate the question that was asked? I mean, obviously there's a connection between technology and feeding the world, whether that's the world in your backyard or the world across an ocean. But Mandy's shying away from that one. She's looking at John, she's waiting on you to dive on that hand grenade.
I know the research that we've done and I've also seen says they're very worried about my family. And I think on the life expectancy of the family, I've come across in the market research that we've done where the husband and wife, mother and father eat traditionally raised beef, pork, and poultry, and they feed natural organic poultry or proteins to their children. And the same way with other organics. They're looking after it's so many of the activists group, and frankly, I think in many cases the activists are out there because it's a way to make a living, and it's a very controversial way to make a living. But it's you can make awfully, as HSUS people can show you, you can make an awfully good living of being an activist, and it's just frightening when other people tell you that you're not doing everything that you can do to raise your children and your family correctly. It's within your means to buy organic, and it is the best. And I mean, this is the dichotomy that we're facing with the consumer that's out there today. And unless we can put a face, I still think we've got to put a face on agriculture somehow to market what we're doing and doing correctly. I mean, I found Mandy's presentation, we were comparing before making it out here, but it's fascinating. I mean, this is out of the gate. Technology is in agriculture, but we've got to play catch up somehow to say that this is safe.
Yeah, I mean, for consumers, I think it's been demonstrated in the various initiative campaigns that their number one concern is cost. You're right, the issue of feeding the world and being altruistic or any sort of technology advances that help developing countries is not the message that consumers are most intrigued by. It's the cost to them, and I think that's a very valid concern. The issue of feeding the world is more the concern of the manufacturers, because we are thinking about it more long-term and having access to ingredients. When I was talking about the GM sugar beets in Europe, I forgot to mention that some of the notes that I'd taken off that slide was that originally the GM sugar beets were developed in Europe first. And the decision about labeling there was made after they had first started to develop GM sugar beets in Europe. In 2003, when they made that labeling decision, the technology developers abandoned it there. And it was brought to the US, and within a couple of years had nearly universal adoption of GM technology in the sugar beets. The application for GM approval in Europe is still pending after first being filed in 2000. So there is concrete evidence that when you stigmatize the technology, you drive away interest in it, not just from consumers, but from the actual developers. So this longer term issue of feeding the world and coming up with new varieties that solve serious pressing problems like with citrus greening, it's a legitimate concern that you simply lose access to those solutions when you demonize the technology to the extent that's being done by activists.
It's a big challenge. I hate to leave the panel on what might otherwise be a pretty sobering reality, but I want to thank John and Mandy both for an outstanding conversation. I'm going to give them a round of applause, please. Our second panel discussion in this breakout session is called Fueling Profitability. It's going to look at a different side of this kind of conversation that we're having today. Two panelists, Caleb Little with the National Biodiesel Board and Alan Weber with Mark IV. Caleb, if you want to start making your way up, you're going to be first up. Caleb serves as the communications manager for the National Biodiesel Board. His primary responsibility is to ensure that board members and the public have ready access to accurate, up-to-date information about clean burning renewable biodiesel. Caleb was a graduate of Kansas State University and the Little Apple with a degree in agricultural communications and journalism. He has worked with state commodity associations, agricultural publications, and research and extension. Please welcome Caleb Little.
You have the clicker for the slide. All right, thank you for that introduction, Andy. It's not super regular that I get to come back this direction. I'm in Jefferson City where our national headquarters are, but anytime I do, I try to wear the K-State purple because they give me grief for it in the office. So any chance I can get out and do that, I do. But to change gears a little bit, pun intended, talking a little bit about what the biodiesel industry does. We heard this morning in Andy's opening that there are some of these black box issues that go along with food and the animal ag industries. One of those being the transportation sector. And we heard a lot from our speakers this morning about the importance of sustainability and how are we going to raise more food with less resources. And biodiesel actually is an opportunity for these industries to pair both of those together. And for the livestock industry, not only is it a more sustainable way to transport those products to the marketplace and to consumers, it also has a profitability side and a benefit that my colleague Alan Weber will be able to dive into a little deeper in the second half of this. So just to start out, the National Biodiesel Board, we have about 300 or so members, 100 production facilities commercially producing fuel across the country. Those little red dots on the map kind of give you an idea. Pretty regionally diverse industry, a lot in the Midwest, but there's also a lot produced, California, East Coast, Texas, population centers, and also where you find those raw materials that the industry uses. Give you a snapshot of where the industry has come from. That's millions of gallons. So about 10 years ago, a very, very small production capacity of a little over 100 million gallons. That 1.8, 1.75 billion gallons of production equates to about 5% of the on-road diesel fuel market. So to put that into that perspective of how much diesel fuel we use in this country to transport goods and services. Some of the benefits of biodiesel definitely come from those sustainability aspects. So it's cleaner burning, it's a renewable resource. When you think about our current transportation infrastructure, it's set up on fossil fuels. And those reasons for that changing climate that we heard earlier this morning really come into play because if you think about it, fossil fuels are carbon that has been sequestered over millions and millions of years of Earth's history, put deep down into the ground. And what we're doing is we're taking those up out of the ground and releasing them up into Earth's atmosphere. Whereas biodiesel is different. It's actually recycling that carbon through the plant's natural systems, pulling carbon out of the air into plants. That plant matter through either oils or starches gets turned into a fuel. So when that fuel is burned, that carbon is just making a loop. So it was already in the atmosphere before. So we're able to replace millions of gallons of that fossil carbon that we'd be pumping into the atmosphere otherwise. And just some other things. It has a high energy balance, basically. The well to wheels analysis, for every 1 unit of energy you have to put in to get biodiesel, you get about 5.5 units out. Comparison, petroleum diesel is a negative correlation, so it actually takes a little more energy than you get out of it in the production side. Biodiesel is not a new fuel. From that 10 years of growth, we've had many industry champions. All of these brands, organizations, national landmarks, they all rely on the fuel and a lot of them do so because of its sustainability aspects. So trying to become more green. We're just, one example, we were just down at the Kennedy Space Center for Earth Day a couple of weeks ago, working with them on a sustainability symposium of what can they do for all their fleet vehicles, tourist buses, construction equipment, on and off road, et cetera. So a lot of folks relying on it to get better at what they do. The renewable fuel standard, I'm sure, is something you've heard of, especially if you're in the livestock industry. It's a pretty hot political issue right now. The biodiesel industry has a little bit different story to tell than some of the other biofuels that are involved in the program. It was originally designed, and the law was intended to essentially require the large petroleum companies to use a certain percentage of their fuels to come from renewable resources. So whether that is a biodiesel, a renewable diesel, an ethanol, cellulosic ethanol, those kind of things. So the idea was basically Congress said, we have a problem and here's how we're going to try to fix it on the transportation side. Just one thing to note, if you look over around 2015, you see that conventional biofuels category flatline. Currently in the US, most of that is made up of ethanol from corn. So that category was actually built as the base of that program. And then in those out years, so 2015 on, is really where those advanced biofuels like biodiesel really carry the water for the program and expand. And for those that don't know, the advanced biofuel definition by the EPA means it reduces greenhouse gas emissions by at least 50% or better. That didn't carry over my my tags there, but so this is the breakdown of feedstocks that biodiesel producers across the country are using to make the fuel out of. That's one of the cool benefits for me and interesting aspects that make biodiesel a bit unique is that it comes from so many different things. Basically any fat or oil you can make biodiesel into through a pretty easy chemical process that is actually easy enough. It's made itself into a lot of high school science curriculums. So it's a pretty easy and safe process. But the green category, that's about 50% of that is from soybean oil. And the other categories, the light blue is animal fats. So about 10% of the biodiesel industry is using animal fats. Distillers corn oil is one of the growing categories, that gold color. So they're actually taking some of the extra fat out of the DDGs out of that process. And then there's canola and then some other oilseed crops in there in that makeup. So since soybean oil is about half of the biodiesel feedstock, we typically use that as our example when we're talking about the economics of the oils and oilseed crops. And it helps to understand, if you start from the very beginning, soybean is by nature about 80% meal, 20% oil, and it's grown for that protein meal that all of you all in the livestock industries are feeding to your cows and chickens and pigs. And historically, that protein demand has driven soybean economics. That's essentially how the biodiesel industry in this country got its start. Was a group of soybean producers said, this oil, we can't get enough of it into the food market. It's dragging down our prices. We've got to find something else of value that we can do with this stuff. So because that's a fixed relationship, the more protein that is demanded, the more oil there's going to be. And that's from, basically all fats and oil sources, whether it's soybean protein that's in demand, or if it's more animal protein, you're going to have the soybeans to feed those livestock, feed those cattle and hogs. So there's that more oil on the market. We've talked about this pretty extensively already today, but this just shows of that population growth. It's not really the developed world and not the least developed world that's growing. It's that middle in between. And that's who's demanding that protein. And this is just another example, just from a continent standpoint. That the white bar on this side is 2007 and then 2030. So that's the change in demand of protein. So you can see those from an overall increase of about 40% more protein. So theoretically, if the economics of how soybeans worked were in reverse and oil was the driving market or driver of those soybean prices, as this demand for that protein is going up, that means there's more oil to use too. And so those are locked together. And Alan's going to talk a little bit about why that's important here in the second half. So this is one of the absolute most common myths that we hear, is that, we go to some event, some sustainability forum or whatever the case may be. And they say, well, you're not doing things right because we've got to feed all these people and you can't be putting this stuff in our fuel tanks because we should be eating it. Well, again, like was mentioned in the session before, those negative points are just so much easier to say in sound bites. And you have to get into a little more explanation of why that's not the case. And really what we're doing here, our friends in the soybean world call it the miracle bean, and it's for a reason. That crop allows us to efficiently grow food, feed, fiber, fuel, all on the same acre. So instead of having to grow one crop for food, one crop for fuel to be able to get that growing food demand to markets and to the countries that need it more efficiently, soybeans actually allow us to do that all together in one spot. And it really all just comes back to our reliance on liquid fuels. The heavy duty transportation, planes, trains, trucks, goods and services, everything we have, every consumer good that we carry around in our pockets got to us somehow, and it got to us most likely on a diesel truck. So to continue to grow the food that we need to feed the world, we also have to grow those other resources that are demanded. So that does include fuel, and biodiesel gives us an option to do that. That's more sustainable. It's better for the economics, and it's reducing our impacts on the environment. So that's just a little bit of an overview about the industry, and then I'll kick it over to Alan now. He's going to get into a little more of the in-depth economics and the profitability and how those soybean meal oil economics impact you all as livestock producers. So, Alan?
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody.
You want to read your own bio, do that. You obviously with the switch.
Oh.
I was so engaged in the Twitter conversation, I was going to let you read your own bio here. Alan Weber is our second panelist today. He is the founding partner of Mark IV, a consulting company that specializes in the development of bio-based products from agricultural resources. Some of Alan's current client responsibilities include positioning biodiesel in the U.S. Alternative Fuels Marketplace and advising the National Biodiesel Board on economic and technical activities. Prior to forming his company, Alan implemented programs and activities relating to market development, education, regulations, and demonstrations regarding biodiesel for the National Soy Diesel Development Board. Now, please welcome Alan Weber.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, very good. I was looking through the slides that Caleb had prepared because, of course, he had his done on time as requested by the conference organizers. But I really got stuck right here on this one. He talked about reliance upon liquid fuels. And it wasn't just the content about how our freight moving across the United States depends upon liquid fuels as well as many other industries. It was more about the word of reliance. And it made me think of the fact my wife just, her sister just had her 40th birthday. And of course, they didn't want to celebrate their birthday at home with kids and everything else. So a bunch of ladies took off and they went to Las Vegas for an extended weekend. I didn't necessarily get to hear any stories about what they did, except for the fact she kept talking about the shows that she had seen. And she was raving about how good they were, their performances and the stunts, all the movements back and forth. And realistically, that made me think of the word reliance and made me think about how our industries, and we do view the livestock sector as a stakeholder and as a partner, are really reliant upon each other, and our profitability is linked. And in many cases, just as in this picture, we may be propping each other up in one form or another. And so that is really the aspects of how we feel that our industries are linked from that standpoint. Now, Caleb had described a little bit about the industry itself, and he talked about federal policy, the renewable fuel standard specifically. One of the things that he didn't necessarily say is that we're unique, or special at least from that perspective, and special from the standpoint that whenever the statute was written, the biodiesel industry is the only industry in which actual requirements outlined on a calendar year basis. So, for example, each year, the EPA administrator, in consultation with the secretaries of agriculture as well as energy, takes a look at market conditions, and based upon those market conditions each year, determines what that requirement should be in terms of use of biodiesel across the United States. So the burden of proof is really on our shoulders to be able to look at market conditions, and we do take that very seriously. And so on an annual basis, we commit a lot of resources to look at everything from impacts on feedstock supply all the way down to impacts on pollinators. And one of the things that we have spent a lot of time trying to look at and categorize is our impacts of an increased production and use of biodiesel on the livestock sector. I've had the chance over the past year or so to be able to reach out and speak with quite a few groups, livestock groups, as well as commodity associations on the state level. One of the things which I have found to be pretty interesting is that there actually is a little bit of a lack of awareness about how important animal fats in the livestock sector are to the biodiesel industry. So when you think about historical uses of animal fats specifically, primarily they've been used in feed or exported to other countries. And interesting enough, when you talk to some of the traders, we find that the export market for animal fats has actually declined pretty significantly over the last few years. You know, the traders attribute that to multiple things. Some of it's sustainability requirements. So some of these animal fats which are being exported, for example, to Europe now have to be mapped and tracked. So they have to be able to go all the way back to be able to understand where those sources come from. And to some degree, if there's a domestic market that actually has more value, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of being able to utilize those same commodities here in the United States. The other thing which is interesting, and Caleb had mentioned it, you didn't get to see it on the slide because it didn't transfer, but he indicated that somewhere between 10 to 15% of animal fats compose the biodiesel industry in the United States. But what it doesn't tell is the fact that when you look at animal fats produced in the United States as a whole, use for biodiesel actually represents about 25% of all of the domestically produced animal fats. So we are a significant portion of the animal fats which are produced here in the United States. And just as one example to show you the significance, and of course I cherry picked and looked at choice white grease, but in the choice white grease industry, more than 40% last year was used to produce biodiesel here in the United States. So it's significant. Obviously, the livestock sector, animal fats are important to us. Can we quantify that and actually put a dollar value to it? Now, for me to be able to come here and speak today, I'm an economist, by the way, by training. I had to promise Caleb that I would not get too far down in the weeds from an economics perspective. Or as Caleb said, don't be boring. So I'm just going to introduce a couple of concepts and then try to summarize a handful of studies and analysis which we have done, which I think really paint the picture of how our two industries are joined at the hip. Not to get back into the weeds, I promise not to, but I do think it's important that we think about some simple economic principles. And we do have to think about prices and the differences between the meat markets and the animal fat markets. Okay, so help me out here as we go. If all of a sudden we have a lot more demand for pork loins or for chicken or for smoked brisket and ribeyes, and we have a tremendous surge in demand, what happens to price? You can help me out. Goes up. Okay. So then over the long term, or at least in the midterm, that price signal goes back to the herds or to the flocks, and we would probably see an expansion of those herds. And then we get further down, and because of the expansion of supply, we actually see a mitigation of that price increase. So prices come back down. It's a cycle we've all seen as producers, right? Whether we're on the row crop side or whether we're on the livestock side. The animal fat markets work just a little bit different. Okay, so in this particular case, if we have an increase in demand, such as biodiesel, that increase in demand is actually going to increase prices a little bit, but because animal fats, as a component of drop value, represent a much smaller portion of the overall carcass value, we don't necessarily see that corresponding increase in supply in terms of a signal. So we get a price increase, we don't get that same signal back to increase supply. And so the end result is we actually keep those prices up and we continue to hold that value. We wanted to actually try to pinpoint this. We started off just looking at correlation. So do prices move together? And we looked at the soybean oil markets and we looked at the animal fats. They do move together. And post-2007, whenever the biodiesel industry took off, we actually saw that correlation increase, which basically meant they moved even closer together after biodiesel production increased. We wanted to go a step further, though, and say, but what portion of the increase in animal fat value was specifically because of biodiesel? So there, economically, we looked at regression, performed a regression analysis. We looked at export markets, the biodiesel contribution. We looked at competing products for energy in the ration, so palm stearine, corn. And when it all factors out, on the inedible tallow side, from this time period, which was January of 2009 to last summer, this analysis was done in the fall of last year, we attributed a little over 10 cents per pound in terms of inedible tallow to biodiesel production, a little over 10 cents a pound to choice white grease, and a little bit under 6 cents a pound in terms of poultry fat. So that was the increase on a cents per pound basis of those particular animal fats specifically due to biodiesel production. So in the room here today, do we have livestock producers that are on the ground with herds, or we got a handful? You count too, Jackie. So there we go. So we have a handful. Groups in here that support livestock producers in terms of either working for commodity associations or otherwise. Okay, so we got quite a handful at that point in time. So this was our attempt to be able to take that back and look at what it means on an individual animal basis. So I should actually add one more thing, which is we have just recently, this will be released this month, Inform Economics has helped us out. One of the things that they wanted to look at was not just the actual impact on prices, but the historic relationship between vegetable oils and animal fats. So historically, soybean oil was here, was at a premium, animal fats were here, always at a discount. One of the interesting aspects is that after an increase in production in biodiesel, that discount weakened. So we've actually brought up on a proportional basis some of the animal fat prices. And so when we take a look at that, at what it means on an individual animal basis, when you look at the amount of tallow, inedible tallow, choice white grease, lard, and poultry fat, we can see that over the same time period that we talked about, a little more than $16 a head in terms of added value for a steer or heifer moving through the sale barn, about $1.25 in terms of a fat hog moving to market. And poultry, not as much necessarily. We're talking only a penny per bird, but there are a lot of birds and still more than $50 million worth of added value to the industry back in 2013. So that's a little bit on the revenue side of the equation. Caleb also introduced, though, the fact that not just on the revenue side, but we have the cost side of the equation as well. In the fact that soybeans, which are the predominant feedstock, as Caleb had indicated, about 50% of the biodiesel production is produced from soybean oil. That soybeans, though, in the United States are not necessarily produced for oil, as he said. We produce for protein. So we crush for protein, soybean oil being the co-product. But if, however, we think about that relationship back and forth of these co-products, they're linked as well. So anytime that we would have an increase in demand for one of the co-products, in this case, the oil, specifically because of a new demand like biodiesel, if that leads to any increased production or it leads to additional crush because it helps to improve crush margins. In the end, what we result in is an additional supply of meal, which does lower the relative value or the relative price of meal, having an impact on rations. Again, this is work that will be released this month from Inform Economics. They took a look over a 7-year time period going back to 2007, looked at each of the individual years in terms of the amount of soybean oil utilized and then the impact that it had on meal values. So what you see on the bars is just the actual range in terms of impact, ranging from somewhere between $21 to $42 over the entire time period. And the actual shaded portion is just a cumulative impact, which is about $6 billion of a decreased protein costs over that same time period. Again, trying to pull this back to a per animal basis, I found that talking with my father, he runs the commercial cow-calf operation. Well, they're his cows, except when the fence needs to be fixed, then they're my cows too. But normally they're just his, and he always wants to talk about, oh, what's this mean to me? And so when we started looking at the amount of soybean meal in a typical ration, and we looked at these impacts, it was about $2.50 on a sow on an annual basis. Feeder to farrow, our feeder to finish operation, a little bit more. On the beef side of the equation, from a dairy standpoint on an annual basis, about $5.50 per head and close to $4 on a feedlot operation. So you don't notice poultry in there. We're just finishing up the poultry analysis. On a turkey basis, this is probably going to be in the 35 to 45 cent range. And on a broiler basis, we're probably talking about a nickel. So you put the two together on broilers, around 6 cents between the revenue side as well as the cost side of the equation. So covered revenues, covered costs. The last thing that I wanted to talk about before we open it up into questions relates to, again, a co-product linkage. Every time that we produce 100 pounds of biodiesel, we also produce about 10 pounds of glycerin. You may or may not be familiar with glycerin, but chances are if there was an ingredient list in your hotel room on the soaps or shampoos, you would probably see glycerin as a component. We also use glycerin in propylene glycol. Your coal trains moving across the United States, a lot of times if they're in cold temperatures, they'll use glycerin to make sure that it doesn't freeze. Glycerin is used as an asphalt release agent. The list just goes on. Several of those are higher value uses for glycerin. However, glycerin is an energy source as well and can be used in feed rations. And it is used quite regularly in ruminant rations in Texas. And working with groups such as the American Feed Ingredients Association, who took the lead, we've helped to ensure that it is listed in the official publication of AFCO. And so therefore, whenever we see energy prices, as in ration energy prices going up, so if you have high corn prices, glycerin can break into the ration. So it's another way to be able to mitigate risk. So realistically, when at least I think about profitability, you think about the simple things, you think about revenues, you think about costs, you think about mitigating risk. Increased biodiesel use and production does help to add value to that carcass. So we know that we've added some dollars back into that value chain on the livestock side. On the cost basis, we know that increased oil demand can help lead to increased supplies of meal, so help keep those costs in check from a protein standpoint. And in certain times, on certain cycles, glycerin, of course, could also be used as an energy source. We're working to help try to quantify this on a state or a regional basis. This is just one example of what it meant in 2014 to the Nebraska livestock industry when you start looking at increased revenues and protein costs for beef, swine, and dairy. I'm glad to be here, and when we can open it up for questions for Caleb. I realistically wanted to be here for just a couple of reasons. I wanted to make sure that that you as our partners understood how serious we take this in terms of our relationship with the livestock sector, the amount of effort that we've gone to ensure that if we get the number right in terms of growth, they can be beneficial for both of our industries. And the second thing is that soybean farmers and the soybean industry are very important stakeholders for our industry. The livestock sector is obviously very important to the soybean industry, you being their number one customer on the meal side. So what's important to soybeans are typically pretty important to us as well. So I know that Caleb and I both look forward to your questions, and we always seek input and feedback as to what we can do better to be able to communicate this message out. So thank you.
So we'll have just a few minutes for questions for these two panelists. And as we've been doing all day, our College Aggies online participants will have the microphone. So just throw your hand up in the air and one of the students will bring you a microphone and we'll put your question before the panel. I'll throw up a jump ball to start with. The two of you can tackle. Typically, when we think about biodiesel, we think about soybeans for obvious reasons. So has there been any discussion of looking at ways to include animal sources as part of that overall image? That the concept of biodiesel and soybeans seem to be really inextricably linked, and for obvious reasons. What role can those animal-derived sources of feedstock play in the broader kind of image of the product in the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen as the industry has grown from those very minuscule volumes in the early years to the billions with a B gallons a year industry, that diversity of those feedstocks and those raw materials that are used has grown tremendously. And at the same time, while the pie is changing shapes, the one thing to keep in mind is that overall total for all categories is going up. So even though probably in the early years, if you would have seen that graphic from 2000, 2001, it probably would have been 85, 90% soybean oil, and then everything else. But, as that shifted down, it's still increasing those volumes of all fats and oils.
You got a question from my right, your left? Yes, my friend from the soybean mafia.
Yeah, thanks. Could you is it possible to put the slide back up with the pork numbers, or do you know that off the top of your head?
How far back?
Yeah.
How far back were we going here?
Another one, keep going back. Next one more there. Thanks.
Oh, I was waiting for the follow-up question. You just want to see the data. That's fair game. All right.
So one of the good things as a communicator, for myself, having an economist that can put it into more plain language, that's an absolute awesome bonus for me. The only negative of that, though, is then he gets all the meaty slides with all the cool numbers, but it's okay.
Caleb,
it's a good trade-off.
Caleb, look at it this way. Most of us who are communications majors did that because we weren't good at math. But those of us who apparently don't want to enjoy our life, when I go back to finish my grad studies, going to be in ag economics. So I figure I'm going to have a pretty steep learning curve when I get back into mathematics. I haven't used in 20 some years. So see how that goes. You pray for me.
No doubt.
From the far left.
What part can the biodiesel industry play in sustainability in the livestock sector? And probably a follow-up, do you know whenever the RFS is going to come out?
You want to take the first half and I'll take RFS?
I was going to take the second half because that was the one I knew. So.
That's the one I knew.
So the question was from a sustainability standpoint, and we actually have an entire component at the National Biodiesel Board, which is directed specifically towards sustainability. Interesting enough, this morning in the session, Jessica, and I don't know if Jessica's in the room here with NRA or not, and one of the things that we haven't even talked about is actually yellow grease, which is also a primary feedstock that's utilized in biodiesel production, which of course is a combination of veg oil as well as animal fats, whatever used in baking, frying applications. So we look at sustainability on several aspects, ranging from energy balance, which is one of the data sources that Caleb had cited in terms of the amount of energy in, energy out. And we look at our relationships with groups like NRA and the Rendering Association, which is a component of the value chain in livestock as well as a major stakeholder. So we'll continue to work together from a stakeholder standpoint. We also highly value having some of the diversity of feedstocks. When you look at the greenhouse gas or the carbon intensity of some of the feedstocks, you'll see that the animal fats rank very well. And so that has actually contributed to a much better footprint from a carbon intensity standpoint. So last year, I'll tie it to RFS and then Caleb, you can go. Last year, when we were discussing back and forth with EPA and the administration, one of the key things that they highlighted was they wanted to know how cost competitive biodiesel was as a technology to abate carbon. So essentially, what was the cost to get rid of or to not produce a metric ton of CO2 and push it into the air? And they were really surprised, actually, that the biodiesel competed very favorably to a number of programs which they considered to be gold medal programs. The carbon intensity or the carbon footprint of animal fat produced biodiesel greatly contributed to that in terms of lowering that greenhouse gas score.
And then on the second half of that, EPA did recently announce, actually as part of a settlement with one of the most recent lawsuits with the API and AFPM, the two major petroleum organizations, that they would introduce, they would repropose the 2014 RVO, so the renewable volume obligation, basically those numbers. They would repropose the 2014 number, which I know sounds crazy, where the time of year we're at, but repropose that number, put out the 15 volume requirement and the 16 volume requirement. They would make that announcement June 1 and have those rules finalized November 30th.
So by the end of the year, we'll have the 2014 numbers for sure.
Exactly. By the end of 15, we'll know 14 for sure.
Yeah, right on target. Right on target. Do one last question.
Caleb, my name is Jackie. I'm with Dairy Farmers of America. On behalf of all of us, thanks for making sure Alan wasn't too boring for his half of the slides. But my question is, we've all read stories, or at least in the dairy industry, we read stories about small-scale biodiesel production from cow manure. Obviously, there are less messy feedstocks, but the manure issue is a big deal for us in the dairy industry. Do you see that as being a viable feedstock at all? And is there any research going into that?
There's definitely some potential there. We've seen a lot of, as the industry's grown, a lot of technology changing on the biodiesel production side. And some of that are some, enzymatic processes that can basically take the higher free fatty acid materials and turn it into biodiesel. So it doesn't have to be a high quality oil to start with to get a high quality fuel product out of it in the end, because of some of that changing technology. So there are some of those kind of things on the horizon as far as biodiesel and renewable fuel production goes. Specific research on the dairy side, I'm not sure
There's
of,
only
but
one thing I would add is at least speaking with some of the dairy producers in the Northeast that have anaerobic digestion as a technology to handle waste, they have actually been utilizing glycerin, depending upon price points, as a substrate in their digesters. The glycerin actually has a lot of methane producing potential, so they've essentially been spiking some of their manure with glycerin when the economics work to be able to generate additional methane, and then they're behind the meter, so they're using that to generate electricity for their operation.
And Alan, when you were doing your studies, did you ever think you would use the phrase that dairy producers are actually spiking their manure with glycerin to stimulate methane
To
production?
get more
I mean,
methane.
No, probably not.
That was not in your graduate thesis, I would
was not.
venture to guess. Let's give these panelists a round of applause. We are going to take a brief intermission. We will reconvene in the combined room when they take down the temporary wall here at 15 minutes past the hour. That means you should be coming back from wherever you are in roughly 10 minutes from now, and be ready to start right at 3:15 with our next speaker, which I think you're very much going to enjoy. So take a few minutes, stretch your legs, get something to drink, and come back at 3:15. Well, my friends, I was a little bit lenient with the schedule on this one. I told you 15 minutes and I gave you more like 25. So ice cream has a way of doing that. But if we could kind of come back here and focus to the center ring of this now floating dairy-fueled bazaar, I think that would be great because we want to kick off our last couple of sessions here. We've had a really exciting journey thus far today. I know the breakout sessions that I had the chance to listen to were really outstanding and gave an in-depth look into some key topics on this broader journey that we've been taking together this morning and this afternoon. So we're going to continue with a session entitled Our Shared Journey of Continuous Improvement with Cameron Brewitt. Cameron is the Chief Sustainability Officer and Head of Corporate Affairs for JBS USA Holdings. He was born in Omaha, Nebraska, earned his bachelor's degree in animal science from Tuskegee University. He was also named USDA 1890 National Scholar in 1993 and the USDA Woodrow Wilson National Fellow in 1995. Prior to his position as Chief Sustainability Officer and Head of Corporate Affairs, Cameron served as Government Affairs and Industry Relations for JBS from 2008 through 2012 in Washington, D.C. In addition to his current role, Cameron is the president of the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, incorporated in Switzerland with administrative offices in Colorado Springs. And several of you in the room, I'm sure, have been following their efforts and heard from Roger Cady earlier, who's been very involved and shared some information from some of Cameron's presentations. So please help me welcome Cameron Brewitt.
Good afternoon. See, this is your problem in agriculture. You have no passion. I said, good afternoon. How is everyone today? Huh? Have you learned anything? Okay, because you're not going to now because you saw most of my slides already. For those of you who don't know who JBS is, we're this small mom and pop meat packer out of Brazil that processes about 100,000 head of cattle every day, about 70,000 hogs, about 13 to 14 million birds, and about 50 to 60,000 sheep and lamb. We're also the largest cattle feeder in the world. We're also the largest global leather processor as an outgrowth of that. So when you think of big badass agriculture, all right, I'm it. Okay? We're also recognized as the second largest global food company in terms of sales. We would have cleared over 50 billion in sales last year. So sustainability, you've heard a lot about it today. It's this new buzzword. The big question though always is, what the hell does it mean, right? It means something different for whoever's talking about it. And you heard some companies and some other people talk about it earlier today, and I would argue some were talking about sustainability, others were talking about sustainable sourcing, right? But we rarely talk about sustainability in the truly holistic manner that the science of sustainability demands. We get confused between what we're trying to communicate to consumers and the actual science of sustainability. There is a science to sustainability. You don't get to make up what it means something, right? But here's our challenge. It's the consumer's view of what sustainability means. This is Norman Rockwell's 1948 The County Agent. And I'll just point out a few things. You've got the little white girl with the curly hair and the 4-H folder under her arm. She's got her jeans pegged like I used to do in high school. You've got the agent with the little brown and white calf there. Got free-range chicken running around spreading avian influenza, getting salmonella. Cats and dogs are living together in harmony. Red and white barn. There's no black people. There's no Hispanics, right? It's this idyllic notion of old school agriculture. You've got American Gothic, Grant Wood's famous painting with the farmer's wife who may not make it to see tomorrow. You have these rolling hills, these red and white barns, the black and white cattle, free-ranging, horse-drawn carriages. Then you have these niche programs, like organic or like grass-fed, right? I like grass-fed until about the third time I've had it. But if people like it, that's fine. But people are associating niche programs with sustainability, right? And sustainability has nothing to do with a particular system. It's system independent, okay? I love this one. We are sustainable. Why? They're 100% grass-fed, on pasture always, no pesticides, no irrigation, family farm raised, never confined, no hormones, pause, breath, organic practices, no antibiotics, no fertilizer, and never fed corn. Now, it sounds like a tasty steak, nothing wrong with it, but this is how they're defining sustainability in all these niche categories. And it's confusing the heck out of consumers. And I apologize for the bluntness of this, but I threw a party, but the cattlemen couldn't come. Why? Because beef causes impotence. I didn't make this up. This is out there, right? This is from our friends at PETA telling you to go vegan. And then you can't be a meat-eating environmentalist. Every farmer or rancher I've ever met in my life is an environmentalist. And then taking meat off your plate can cut your carbon footprint in half, but then who would want that plate, right? So if we don't define it, here's some of our elitists that will. They're showing Food Inc. in American schools now with no counterpoint. Chris Leonard, who I just got off the phone with this morning, he's a great advocate for our industry. The Meat Racket was an expose about conventional agriculture, big agriculture, primarily aimed at Tyson, which didn't bother me, but still attacking corporate agriculture. My people are up to it as well. You have the Food Babe, right? She's this gal who likes to look at ingredient labels, and if she can't pronounce the multi-syllabic word there, then she says it should be banned from the food supply. She's a true scientist. And then we have Jamie Oliver, right? He's got that pretty British accent. He basically came out and said we shouldn't be using this LFTB because they use ammonia in the process, right? And we eliminated it from our food supply, right? It's coming back now, but we eliminated it. Why? Under the guise of sustainability. Right? But this is a technology that allowed me in my beef packing plant to do more with less. To do more with less. And a lot of these niche programs I showed you do less with more. It's not to say that they're unsustainable on their face, but we're having a very backwards conversation, right? How many more cattle, how much more water, how much more fertilizer, how many more emissions do we have to put into the environment by removing this technology from our food supply? It was an unsustainable act, right? But consumer activism made us do it. Perspective matters, right? Perspective matters. When you look at sustainability, the lens by which you view it often determines the definition. If you're a social NGO, it's all about slave labor, it's all about fair wages, it's all about employment. Right? If you're an environmentalist, it's all about emissions, carbon footprint, what we're doing to waterways and streams. If, God forbid, and you're in a business, you're worried about your long-term viability, your profitability as a business enterprise. But all of those things encompass sustainability. So perspective matters. So you have to understand who you're talking to. I like Frank's quote, by the way. Not saying I live by it, I just say I liked it. One of the challenges is we have this huge modern disconnect from agriculture, okay? Less than 1% of our population in the United States is involved in farming, right? So most Americans, their interaction with agriculture is in a grocery store. For all they know, it came from the back parking lot, right? So the old county mouse, city mouse paradigm is really challenging today, okay? No one gets off of work and goes and buys a steer and knocks the head off in the backyard. Right? People are not connected with modern agriculture. So it makes us extremely vulnerable, particularly when we don't talk about what we do, why we do it, and how we do it. And it's not just telling people our story. I hear this all the time. We just have to tell our story. Like it's going to wash over these people and they'll just get it. And then they'll say, okay, I'm with you now. Right? That's false. It's about having a dialogue. It's about having a dialogue with some pretty crazy people sometimes. Right? But we have to engage in a dialogue so that they understand some of the trade-offs. And then we have activist pressure, right? We have these videos. Another one just came out today, hitting the pork industry. This handsome devil was responsible for a lot of this, right? with his BT cotton shirt. And HSUS brags about this, right? We're inside of corporate boardrooms across the country helping major food retailers implement policies to eliminate gestation crates from their supply chains, right? And I had a meeting with some very powerful retailers just not too long ago. And they said, Cameron, we have made all these claims that we're going to remove this from our supply chain by 2022. Congratulations. So how do we get there? I really have no idea. Did you think about that in 2012? No. People are to get activists out of their boardroom as risk mitigation. And they often do it under the guise of sustainability. They make completely unsustainable decisions, and then they turn to the rest of us, bottom feeders in the supply chain that are just providing product, and say, you need to do the following things by the following date in order to have the pleasure of continuing to do business with me, right? And then you've got the internet. Abraham Lincoln had great foresight. He's a brilliant man. But we've seen in some of the other discussions about how pseudoscience is put out on the internet and people lap it up. They love it, right? And then they do robocalls, they get in the boardrooms, they tell people these things, and all of a sudden, LFTB is gone. Gestation stalls are gone, right? We are hurting our industry by listening to people who do not ever intend to consume our products. Imagine that for a moment. People are going into boardrooms who do not desire, do not want to eat the products that they're telling you how you should grow and raise them, okay? I happen to believe in God. If you don't, that's fine. You're just going to hell. But I happen to believe in God, right? I would not go to an atheist and ask him for counsel on how to pray, all right? But this is what we're doing. We're letting these activists tell us what to do about products they don't even want to consume. So the consumer is very confused in my view. It's a protect me from what I want kind of situation. I want local and natural because it's better for the environment. Please show me the study that proves that. And it's better for my health. They just asked the head of the USDA organic program, are these products safer? And he ducked for cover, ran for the hills, didn't provide an answer because there's no proof that it's safer, right? But they don't want food from big badass companies like me, because I'm bad for their health. I'm bad for the environment. We have to always remember modern agriculture, what you men and women do in this room and what you students hope to do in the future. We have created the most modern, the most efficient, the safest, and yes, the most globally dispersed agricultural system in the history of mankind. It's why the population is going to explode to 9.5 billion, maybe 10 billion people by 2050, and we'll be able to meet the challenge. It's not because of the Norman Rockwell painting, it's because of what we're doing today. We never take credit for it, we never brag about it. Farmers don't want to be bothered with microphones and media at their operations. We just do our work, we go about doing what we do, right? But what we do is amazing, it is awesome. We should be proud of it. Ben Bernanke, both humans' capacity to innovate and the incentives to innovate are greater today than in any other time in history. No question about it. The question is, are we going to be able to utilize these new technological tools and innovation to meet this growing demand? Will the consumer let us, right? And if we keep listening to rich white Europeans and Americans, the answer will be no, right? Because they are making choices to remove technology, to remove innovation from their food supply. Why? Because they can afford it, right? This is how it always feels. I am not Jesus on this picture. Good guys, bad guys, right? This is how the critics often frame this debate. There's actually a good food movement. What in God's creation does that mean? A good food movement, right? It's all local. Okay, as far as I know from my animal science background, most food comes from the ground. So it's all local. It's just globally dispersed, right? And that's a good thing because I live in Colorado and I like bananas And they don't grow bananas in Colorado, right? So this is the frame of the debate. It's a poor place to have a conversation. I know I pick on my organic and my natural and my grass-fed and my bottle-fed milk friends, but they're all part of agriculture, right? We have to stop having the bickering and the infighting amongst ourselves as an industry and celebrate all of agriculture in its various forms. And if people are crazy enough to pay a premium for something, God bless them, let's give them some of it, right? But let's not try to equate a niche system as what all of agriculture should become. Because if we do that, there's going to be a lot of people on the planet Earth, frankly, that are going to die. And a lot of them are going to look more like me than you in this room. They're going to be brown and yellow, okay? I believe it's immoral to promote systems that do less with more as the panacea. I believe it's immoral, okay? So we have what I like to call the concerns of the full stomach, these wealthy people, right? So 44%, they say, of Americans are food involved. This is a study from Ketchum. And 22% of them are evangelists. That's the little ants. They know what's good for you. They know what's best for you. If you don't believe them, just ask them. They'll tell you. You should be eating this way. You should only have these types of choices. 48% of them are young, under 35. I remember when I was under 35, I had hair and I looked really good. 46% of them are parents. 62% of them are female. And their income is well above average. So we're increasingly chasing these wealthy consumers and modifying our production system to mollify their concerns, both real and imagined. All right? I mean, what more needs to be said? And so what has been the commercial response? It's been sober, rational. McDonald's has said that they're going to start sourcing verified sustainable beef. And I love McDonald's. They sell a lot of meat. I think they're responsible for maybe 1% of all beef. I mean, that's a huge number, right? So we want McDonald's to be successful. And I was in Oak Brook when they made this announcement that they're going to start sourcing verified sustainable beef. And I asked them, well, what are you sourcing today? They said, no, Cameron, we believe that the beef that we're sourcing is sustainable. We just want to verify it. Well, that's fine. I think we should encourage that and help them along this journey, right? But again, they've been fairly collaborative. Others have not been as collaborative. I don't mean to imply that by showing the Walmart slide. Maybe I do. I don't know. They've announced a Standards of Excellence program where they're going to touch at least 50% of the cattle industry by close of 2016. That's of their own supply. And they have a beef pilot program where they're going to include environmental criteria as part of their sourcing policies for beef. So you're seeing more and more corporations viewing sustainability from a sourcing avenue. Have you seen McDonald's or Walmart in the news within the last 6 months about wages, about how their employees are treated? These are sustainability issues as well. Right? So for you here representing large multinational corporations who are creating sustainability policies, when you're going to go out, certify, verify, check farms, do all these things, sustainable sourcing is part of your journey. It is not the sustainability journey, though. That's not all of it, right? How you treat those members of your team, what you do in these local communities, your philanthropic impact, your corporate social responsibility, these are all part of sustainability too. And when we ignore those issues, we no longer talk about sustainability. Now we're talking about an environmental program. There's nothing wrong with environmental programs, right? But to equate sustainability to environmental, you're no longer talking about sustainability. And then my friends in the US government, God bless them, and all that they stand for. They put out an advisory committee put out a recommendation to the dietary guidelines that basically excludes lean meat, although they did put in a footnote and said, it's okay. We just don't like it all that much. But moderate alcohol consumption is the way to go. Right? And this is a huge challenge because these activists, these people who believe passionately about it, I mean, I have to beg you all to say good afternoon, right? These people are invading the government. They're doing all this crazy stuff, putting more and more pressure on livestock and protein meat industries, right? Because they have an agenda. They believe they know what's right. They believe they know what's right for you, and they'd like to enforce it on the rest of us, right? This is a huge challenge. So what's the reality? We've got some 2050 global trends. I'm sure everyone has said this to you. What's the main point? 3 billion in middle class growth by 2050. What's the population of China today? Anybody know? 1.5 billion. So 2 Chinas are coming. 2 Chinas are coming. All right? In the middle class. Why does that matter? When you take someone from poverty to low income, or from low income to the middle class, what happens? You go out and buy a new Cadillac. Admittedly, it's what some of the brothers do. But what most people do is they improve their diet. Okay? Protein, dairy, eggs, meat. So the reality is that you have this huge wall of demand coming. No matter what we do, it's coming, right? So we can put our heads in the sand and try for meatless Mondays and say we should all go vegan. I travel all around the world. I have never once come back from overseas and said, I haven't had a delicious cup of lentil soup in like 8 days. I can't wait to get to Whole Foods so I can crush some beans and make lentil soup. I've wanted a sirloin though. I've wanted a ribeye. I've wanted a pork chop, right? There is a love affair with the products that we produce, okay? And people just want to feel good. They want to have that social license to continue to consume products they already love. And per capita consumption is not going to go up, particularly in the US and Europe, where all these crazy concerns come from. There's just going to be more people, right? And so we have to feed them. But we do have an environmental challenge because currently BASF states that we're using about 1.5 planets of resources. We're going to need 70% more food. And to do that at our current trajectory, that would take 3 planets. And we don't have 3 planets, right? No one's cultivating the moon. Climate change, where we grow some of these crops globally, maybe we shouldn't be growing them anymore, right? What are going to be the changes in where we produce the agricultural goods that we're producing? And then we consume a lot of water. A lot of water. I do a lot of it in my plants for food safety, right? This may be the true great challenge of our time. How do we find enough water? Ask any Californian or Texan, right? It's reality. It's a huge challenge. So how do we meet the challenge? One suggestion. I have a running list that I've been working on. If you have any recommendations, let me know. I'll add it. I think it's important, though, that we kind of understand the real story when it comes to sustainability versus the perception out there. If you look at beef, they've reduced across all these areas. We did a LCA in partnership with NCBA. Participated, drug dealers, environmentalists, everyone, all committed data, provided data. And we showed all these trends from 2005 to 2011 of how we're reducing our environmental impact, right? So big nasty ag like me is actually doing some great things in the plants, on the farm, with cattle genetics, with water consumption, greenhouse gas emissions. We're doing all these great things, right? But everyone says that we're unsustainable. If you look at pork, over the last 50 years, they put a study. They're using 7%, 1% less water. Right? Over 50 years, you